Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to wait a few more minutes while people arrive. I know there's a few people still joining us from the waiting room, so we'll just give it a few minutes and then we'll get going. So for those of you just coming in, we're just waiting until a few more people join us from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Okay, so we're just after 11. I think everyone's joined us from the waiting room now, so we'll get started. First of all, thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's great to see so many of you. We had almost 350 people register for this event, and I think that's not only a testament to the wonderful speakers we've got lined up today, but also a testament to the subject and how important it really is. First of all, I'm sure you're all used to this now after a year of webinars. But just some quick housekeeping. So just so you know, this webinar will be recorded, so you can access it later online if you wish to. Do feel free to participate on social media. Today we'll be using the hashtag climate engagement. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A function. Do feel free to use that. Ask questions of our speakers. Or if you see other people's questions that you'd like to hear answered, then just upvote them and that'll bring them to the top of the screen for us. And questions will be answered in the Q&A session at the end after we've heard from all our speakers. After the session, we will send you a recording of the webinar and some further information as well that you'll hear in today's session. So first of all, I'm thrilled to be joined by the wonderful panel of speakers we have with us today. I'll introduce them to you shortly. You've got a glimpse of who they are on the screen there, and I'm sure many of you have joined us today to hear them speak. However, first I'd like to speak a little bit about what we're doing at Commonplace and why and what we're doing to play our part in tackling the climate crisis and why that's so important to us. At Commonplace, we believe in social value and the theory of change. We believe in social proof, enabling others to see and understand the thoughts and ideas of their neighbours and come into a common understanding within their community. We believe in critical mass, engaging large numbers of diverse people in meaningful and constructive conversations. And we believe in continuous engagement, ongoing engagement that's always switched on at people's convenience, not just at one event. As part of this, we have a really special team in place. Our team at Commonplace is made up of urban change makers, trained planners, and people who really understand politically led organisations. For me, with my other hat on, I'm a councillor and I'm a former town council leader. So I've seen firsthand the value of bringing communities together and involving them in discussions about improvements to the places where they live, work and play. This is particularly critical when it comes to talking about the climate crisis, because ultimately, to make a real impact, we all have to play our part, both locally at a grassroots level and also in the wider world. Up until last year, an incredible 300 local authorities, or over 300 local authorities, and that's about 74% of them, had declared a climate emergency. And that number's still rising. Council chambers up and down the country saw lively debates from dedicated councillors and passionate local community members, full of ambition on how their local communities could contribute to this positive change and do it at pace. Officers have got to work deploying their professional expertise and put into action many of the ideas and proposals that perhaps a few years ago seemed too challenging to move forward on. There's a widespread realisation that tackling the climate crisis at a local level has a huge impact on global well-being. My small town council didn't have the capacity or the resource to carry out a big citizens' assembly, as we've seen some authorities do. So for us, we had to be even more creative. So pre-COVID, we held a public meeting and we packed out our town hall. We included high-profile speakers and expert speakers from local authorities, from other local authorities, and also climate campaign groups. We held a public policy building session, allowing our residents to be a proud and positive part of the change that we were making in our town, while also building community networks and building trust through transparency. Obviously now, the pandemic has stopped us from holding face-to-face meetings such as this, and conversations have moved online. I think that the future is likely to include a mix of in-person and online communication. But why do we need to engage communities in climate action plans at all? I mean, surely councils know broadly what it is that they need to address within their areas. Well, we know from recent polling that we did across 1,000 people in the UK, that there is a burning desire from communities to be involved at a local level. 76% said that they want to participate in the planning process, and 71% of people want regular access to updates on local issues. If you want real change to be made, you've got to find ways to change behaviour. And that's why community engagement is so important. We're fortunate enough today to have Claire Stocks with us, who I know will talk a little about exploring behavioural change in a bit more detail. But one theory I particularly like is the IKEA effect. When you build something yourself, you value it more. And no comments on the fact that I may have this bookcase in my house. It's extremely important. We see exactly this when we're engaging communities. We see that this process of them being involved helps them shape better climate policies. At Commonplace, we believe that through engagement, you can get people invested in plans and strategies so they can become part of the solution themselves. And this is why we want to continue helping local authorities achieve getting their communities involved in their climate action. One of the authorities we've been working with on this is Hammersmith and Fulham. Hammersmith and Fulham set out some really clear objectives: reaching net zero by 2030, increasing tree cover and biodiversity, and rebuilding from COVID to create healthier and greener communities. We worked with them on their engagement through our design feedback module and also through our news function. I'm going to take you in just to their site here to have a look. So you can see here, this is the site where we landed on when you go there. And Hammersmith and Fulham chose to use our design feedback module. They put together 9 tiles to address their climate plan. The first, a generic plan, a generic consultation about what's important to you and your family. So really gauging the sentiment of what people in their community wanted to see happen. And then they broke it down into themes: transport and travel. I won't read them all out, but you can see them here. Themes as to what they could do with their climate plan. By clicking into their tiles, you can get a little more information. And then this project's obviously closed now, but when the consultation was open, you can go in and people can comment and really give their sentiment and their feeling on what's happening in these particular areas. After the webinar, if you want to go in, this site's still it's still live, although it's not open for commenting. You can go in and have a look at some of the comments people made. Another one was Camden. Camden used our climate action map. They used our heat map as part of their climate action plan. They had a really lovely engagement with an interactive map. And again, you can go in and take a look at this. Residents were able to drop pins and really locate exactly what they'd like to see happening in particular areas. Or they could make a comment that this was for the whole town. So at Commonplace, our focus is on connecting people to the places that they work, live and play, and involving them in key decisions that affect their community. So last year, as we went into lockdown, we didn't want this mission statement to just be something that's on our about page. So what we decided to do was we decided to offer our platform for free to local authorities trying to engage their communities and coordinate their response to the pandemic. Many councils used our platform to help organise their active travel planning to ensure that people could cycle, walk and socially distance in their local area. Over the last 12 months, we've worked with 66 local authorities on projects collecting over 480,000 contributions from local people engaging in the process. The data collected in these projects allowed councils to implement short and long-term active travel interventions with a strong support of the local community, so they could make changes with real confidence. Now, following on from this success, we want to help out our local authorities again by similarly offering our services to help coordinate their climate action plans. Now we understand that many local authorities, and probably many of you on the call, are at various stages of your planning and engagements with your climate action plan. But we're here to support you by offering the Commonplace platform to act as a central point where proposals can be shared and ideas can be posted and conversations with the community can take place. We've put together 2 useful starting points. So first of all, our community heat map to crowdsource ideas on how to tackle the climate crisis from your community in your location. And second is our climate action plan design feedback to share your plan and collaborate with the community on your climate strategy. We realise the need for flexibility, and therefore we'd love to hear your ideas about how we can improve this template further to help you reach your local community members. If you're interested in learning more about this, we'll send out some information following today's webinar, and just click on the link and one of our engagement experts can get in touch with you to talk further. Now, I'm sure you've all had enough from me today, so I'd really like to spend some time listening to our panel. We're really thrilled to have a really broad range of experts with us today. First of all, we're starting with Simon Sturgess. Simon is an architect and founder of Targeting Zero, a carbon consultancy. Simon is widely recognised as an expert, an innovator, and a lateral thinker in delivering a low carbon, resource efficient built environment. He's written official policy on embodied and whole life carbon and is co-author of the Greater London Authority's New London Carbon Plan. So Simon, I'll drop my screen down here and then it's over to you.
Thank you, Rosa. I will hope that this works. Good. Well,
Looks good to me, Simon. I can see.
Good. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me on this. I'm going to talk about this net zero from the built environment perspective. And the first slide here is really to do with what the built environment is responsible for. And you can see here that the orange basically represents the built environment. So these are global CO2 emissions. And you can see it's by far and away the biggest bit. In fact, for the UK, the combined total of those two is probably larger as a proportion, because and those emissions come from really 2 directions. One is the use of energy, which we're all kind of familiar with, but probably less familiar for a lot of people is the fact that the actual construction and maintenance of buildings also absorbs a huge amount of carbon emissions. So what are we interested in? What we're interested in, or what I'm interested in, is understanding the carbon emissions that are caused by extracting materials from the natural environment. What happens to them in use, and ultimately where do they go, and what does that mean for carbon emissions and for the environment generally? Now, as I mentioned, the emissions really come in sort of 2 sorts. There's the operational emissions, which is the energy use, and there's the embodied emissions, which are construction and maintenance, repair, replacement, and so on. And those 2 types of emissions over the life of a new building are roughly equivalent. So it's not as if operational emissions is a lot bigger or embodied is a lot bigger. They're roughly equivalent, and both of them obviously contribute to global warming. And that photograph is not Baghdad or somewhere in Spain. That's actually Hyde Park last summer, and that is because obviously our summers are getting progressively warmer. Now, I apologize for the graph, but this is showing you every 5 years the aggregate of carbon emissions over the life of a new building. This happens to be a residential block. And to give you an idea of how these emissions actually occur. So when you build a building, that's the dark blue. So that's the initial, if you like, hit of carbon emissions, referred to as upfront carbon emissions. And then as you go through, you've got in pink, you've got the day-to-day energy use, the operational emissions. And those are, as you can see, gradually increasing, and in aggregate year on year, the curve is starting to flatten out a bit because we're supposed to be getting to net zero. And if that happens, then that will then level out completely. And then you've got the pale blue, which is the in-use embodied emissions. So that's repair and replacing things like boilers and plant and roofs and anything that you might do to repair and replace the contents of the building. And if you look at those two numbers down below, 2030 and 2050, if by 2050 we're trying to get to zero carbon economy, you can see that the blue is still greater than the pink. And therefore, what this is saying is that the embodied emissions in the short term, at least, are very, very critical. And if we want to get down, we have to tackle these emissions, the blue in particular, and of course the pink anyway. For existing buildings, of course, the blue is much, much lower, and the pink is the predominant issue. So what that means, of course, is that for a lot of the buildings that we have built or recently or are still building, they are already obsolete in the face of the climate crisis. And the reason for this is because all glass buildings, and you can see in this photograph, most of these buildings in the City of London are all fully glazed. Either they're double glazed units, which are letting in still an enormous amount of heat gain, which means we need huge amounts of energy to cool the buildings, or they are using complex triple glazed units, which have quite a depth and quite often include blinds. And those units have a huge embodied cost. So in terms of the construction of them, and of course, the replacement, because most of those units do not last longer than 30 or 40 years, although you would expect buildings like this to last at least a century or more. So these buildings have an inbuilt problem. And I think that's going to become an increasing problem as tenants and so on and investors realize that these are not the sort of things they want to be associated with. And already we know that many of the big banks are getting out of oil and gas exploration. And I'm sure Chris will know more about that kind of thing. But what this means, I think, is that these buildings that we're still building are already obsolete. But in London, what we have is, which is something I've been involved with, both of these. So this is on the left, this is the policy SI2, the whole life carbon assessment for guidance. So this is what, if you're doing a large scheme in London, this is what you will be required to undertake, a carbon assessment. And this covers the entire life cycle of a building. So this is the construction emissions, the sourcing of materials, which obviously can be mitigated by things like recycled content, or better still, don't build a building, use what we've already got. But it also takes you through the life cycle of the building, the in-use stage, how do you reduce that? And of course, the end of life, what happens to the building at the end of its life? Ideally, it doesn't have an end of life because it's robustly built and will continue and can be reused. But if it is going to be taken apart, then you want it to be disassembled rather than demolished, and you want those parts and components to have a future value. And that's what that policy is doing, is requiring people to assess these things. And that is all pretty much based on the document on the right, the RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment, which is something that I co-authored, which led the team. And that is really what is now the sort of UK standard. In fact, it's being used in parts of Europe as well, and also the US, but it's now the standard for assessing and the methodology for assessing how you calculate carbon emissions through construction. And in fact, I'm working with a group called the Whole Life Carbon Network to upgrade and improve this. Thank you very much. Oh, I've got one more, hold on. There we go. So if there's a choice, and it's really about what these people want, these people obviously are going to be occupying the buildings that we are, people like me as architects are designing. And what do they want? And I suppose the question is, should new construction be meeting regulations or should be much more ambitious? And in my view, if we are only meeting regulations, then again, the buildings risk obsolescence. And in order to reduce future risk, both for the planet, but also for people in these buildings, we have to be much more ambitious. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Simon, and interesting to hear the word ambitious. It's something we hear constantly when we're talking about the climate crisis and how we're moving on to repair it. Simon, we've got a question that I think is really interesting, so I'm going to ask you it now. Actually, I'm going to break from what I said and ask you now before going to our next speaker. We've got a question that says, I believe my council has declared a climate emergency, but the planning department appears to be ignoring it. They don't seem to understand that houses should last for 100 years plus and not 1 year. What can we do about it? Now, obviously, that's a particular view of a particular planning department, but you know there is this idea that houses don't last as long as they used to. I wonder, as an architect, if you'd talk a little about that.
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said, I mean, the buildings we build today need to be the retrofits of the future. We should not be building buildings that have to be taken apart in the future, and as you say, the longer the better. There is a balance because, of course, what you have to do is ensure that the buildings you build today not only have the minimum carbon emissions to build them, but also are durable and flexible and capable of adaptation and change and so on. So there is a bit of a dilemma, but I think all of this, I think the carbon emissions and resource use are two sides of the same coin, if you like. And I think that reducing carbon emissions and reducing resource use are things that we have to do together. And money is a resource, and I do not believe that this is an additional expense. So I think if people are worried about that aspect, I think reducing carbon emissions and reducing cost are also aligned. I think for local authorities, they shouldn't be concerned about getting people submitting planning applications to do this, because I think it's, as I say, it doesn't have to be an on-cost, but it also, I think, will add to the, you know, for the developer's perspective, I think ultimately will add to the value of their properties rather than building things that are going to be, as I say, obsolete.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to answer that, Simon. It certainly answers the question for me, and I hope it does for the person who submitted the question. So next up, I'm really pleased to have Chris here joining us. Chris is from Oxfordshire, just as I am, so it's nice to have a local person on the call too. Chris has been the director of Community Environment Associates for over 20 years, specialising in work linking global and local issues. He has trained many local councils on working with communities on climate and environmental issues. Chris is a board trustee of Friends of the Earth, and he's here today to speak to us about Friends of the Earth's climate action plan for councils. So Chris, I will drop my screen here and let you share yours. And you're just on mute there, I think, Chris.
Sorry, good morning. I will just get the screen up. I hope people can see that. Yeah, Friends of the Earth produced its first environmental charter for local government way back in 1990 and has been engaged in work with communities and local councils ever since. Over the last few years, FOE has done a lot more work on how councils can approach climate change, and I'm going to look at that from a perspective of community engagement. I suspect there's quite a lot of people on the call today, judging by the questions, who are from community groups as well as local councils. And I think it was interesting, 30 years ago, it was definitely the role of environmental officers to speak up for the environment in local councils and often be ignored. I think things are moving on. Now, I think we have to recognise that climate isn't a green issue anymore. It's for everyone. I'm sure some people will have seen the picture on the right here. This is from the Committee on Climate Change, pointing out that only less than half of the changes we need to make are purely technological and scientific. The great majority need people to be involved. It's societal and behavioural change. And if we're going to get that happening, then we have to have people on board. And if we want people on board, we can't bully them. They have to want to do it. We need to make engagement something that is a positive exercise for everyone. And that's been part of what Friends of the Earth has looked at. And local councils, I think, have a critical role in this. Local influencers are really critical to getting people to make changes, to support people. And traditionally, a lot of those have been people like faith groups, community groups, where people can talk, meet with their friends and neighbours, build a little bit of trust. Trust is important because not everyone trusts their local council. It's a shame, but I think it's a fair fact. But councils do have a much greater outreach. And if councils can show that they are really working to make a difference, they have a huge potential for helping deliver these changes. So I think we need not just action by councils, but leadership. Councils actually need to lead by example, to be the change, as well as talk about it and pass planning policies. Councils can enable change by supporting voluntary action, by making sure that local land use is done properly and so on, by creating a policy framework, but above all, by doing the right things. Some of the points in the questions already highlight councils that may well have passed a climate emergency, but haven't necessarily put that into operation. And that problem was one reason Friends of the Earth has tried to something Friends of the Earth has tried to answer with its climate action plan work. 300 plus councils declaring a climate emergency, obviously great, but where's the plan? And so to support that, there's a set of resources. That's the key document. It's available to download, Word or PDF. It's 50 ways to make a difference, and you can get it there. I'll put all these links in the chat afterwards. And what's it all about? It's not just about cutting emissions. It's a plan with 10 sections. And start where you need to begin, where you mean to carry on, sorry. Put the climate at the heart of decision making. Money. That may not be the first thing you think about when cutting emissions, but this needs a budget. And we need to make sure that what we do on climate is fair and just. We need to protect the most vulnerable. And I think those are the starting points that sometimes get forgotten when we rush into issues like buildings, transport, power, and waste. The things you might immediately think of. All of these are essential. Simon's just really pointed out how essential it is that local councils tackle buildings. In the county of Oxfordshire, we're facing up to 1 million new homes, more new homes per head of population than pretty much anywhere. If those aren't built to zero carbon standards, each and every one of them will make things a little bit worse. But we can tackle that. And councils also need to influence others. The land use issue and planning is critical. And councils do actually have a role in campaigning. The group I work with in Oxford has just done a survey of our local councils, all 6. And one of the questions was, what are the obstructions to you really delivering on climate? And one of those, right up the top of the list, is national policy. We need a better policy framework nationally. So that sounds a bit confusing. 10 different issues. There's a lot of support. You'll find things like this one, cutting through the confusion. It's all explained. And it's about making this happen. And if we're serious about engagement, councils really need to think about how they look, how people trust them. So it's that clarity in decision making. It's having people who people recognise, a council officer and a senior councillor, both on board, both understanding, both ready to talk to people. Using, Rosa mentioned, additional decision-making approaches. On a big scale, that's stuff like climate assemblies, but it can be quite simply meetings in community centres. But with the council officers, they're not to tell people what's going to happen, but to listen, to understand, to put this in the perspective of local people. We need the targets, of course, and we need those to be measurable, ideally annually, so we can see how we're moving. And above all, to really recognise that citizens have got a key role in this, because councils have got that role in delivering societal and behavioural change. And the Friends of the Earth strategy isn't just that one plan document. There's a lot of good examples on the website, people actually doing stuff. And we know there's a huge amount of good practice, some of it very good, emerging. It's time to be cautiously optimistic, but also recognising that there's a lot of councils that are still way behind the curve. Local people need to understand how the council works. And, dare I say it, to be pushing the council to actually have a clear action plan. And let's take that a little bit more local. Rosa mentioned town councils. I'm a parish councillor just outside Oxford. All these smaller bodies have a role they can play too. And so there's information on the website all about that. And we can't afford this. We're really short of money. Every council at the moment is staring a financial crisis in the face. We need to look at the climate-friendly policies and practices that can save money, that are affordable. Not everything costs money, but we do need the budget. But that's in there as well. And it is about influencing others. Councils need to work with businesses, with other public sector bodies, universities, schools, colleges, the lot. And to do that, we need to work with the people. This is not something that councils can do to people. It's all about the engagement. And just toward finishing, a couple of points about that. How do our councils and our communities cooperate? Because that's what we want out of engagement, isn't it? Councils have got their own place. They're representative. People are elected. There's procedures and agendas and structures. And above all, there's roles and responsibilities to be delivered. But they've got a budget. On my right, community groups, much more participative. Whoever turns up can get involved and do stuff. And we're not stuck working through the same agendas. We can actually get out there and do something if it needs doing. Some councillors will say, well, those community groups aren't responsible to anyone. And to some extent, they may be right. And of course, the impact of community groups is often smaller because they haven't got the resources. But, big but, both of them, I hope, care about where they live. Some groups will want to stop things happening. We don't like the sound of new stuff. They want to preserve what is valuable to them, and I respect that. Others are looking for new approaches. But there's got to be common ground. What does the council want? What do we want as community groups? What does everybody want? We're generally agreed that moving towards zero carbon is important and essential. So for the councils, it's easy. There are people knocking on the doors, whether it's a Friends of the Earth group or the Women's Institute or Extinction Rebellion. Work with those groups, but don't stop there, because you know what they're going to say, pretty much. They're the usual suspects. How do we get to the faith groups, to the community centres on neglected estates and so on? How do we actually achieve that? And this is an urgent matter. We need ambition. Rosa mentioned that. A cabinet member for my local council recently said, your job is to push us to be as ambitious as possible. And for us, that may occasionally be uncomfortable, but we want to be ambitious too. And I hope that the Friends of the Earth plan will actually help people be ambitious. And let's put this in a national context. 2021, we have COP26 coming up in Glasgow. The UK is president. The UK can set the agenda. We need to be showing that people across the UK care. And I think councils and their communities have a great opportunity to cooperate on that basis. So that's what we're doing in Oxford, the COP26 Climate Alliance, involving local councils, businesses, universities, the lot. I think there's a huge amount to be done, and I hope you'll find the Friends of the Earth Climate Action Plan stuff helpful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. As I said before, it's really wonderful to have you here, and thanks for that sort of whistle-stop tour of what's going on in Oxfordshire, and also the Friends of the Earth Climate Action Plan, which you can find on the Friends of the Earth website if it's of interest to you to read further. Next up, we have a great friend of Commonplace, Claire Stocks. Claire is an experienced digital and broadcast media executive. She has a 17-year career at the BBC, but Claire has now moved into the field of environmental campaigning with a focus on global issues, with a focus on the global issues of carbon emission, ocean pollution, animal extinction, and other human-induced problems. Claire is also an advocate for making our local communities nicer places to live and work through enhanced walking, cycling, and public transport provision. Claire is a founding member of Walk Ride Greater Manchester, and we're really pleased to have you here today, Claire.
Thanks, Rosa. Yeah, I definitely am new to a lot of this. I'm still learning, and there'll be people on this call who probably know more than me about certain things. So I offer things in the spirit of learning and sharing, and no more than that. I'm just going to start with 3 bits of context that I think it's important to take into this discussion. So the first point is that England is actually one of, if not the most centralised countries in the so-called developed world. And that's not me saying that, that comes from the think tank, the IPPR, and that's based on looking at a number of factors, one of the central ones being where does power and particularly financial power sit. So it may surprise you to know that for every pound in tax that is raised, 95 pence goes straight to Whitehall. Someone like Germany, it's 69p. So we need to understand that we have a very centralised political system that doesn't help local action. The second piece of context is austerity. Councils up and down the country, more in the north, have faced up to 40% of cuts during austerity, and COVID is going to take its toll even more. Manchester, my council, is looking at £50 million worth of cuts. They've already cut the nice touchy-feely stuff, the arts, the community work. They're now looking at real frontline services. So when you add that to the first point about centralisation, you know, our council's role in civic life is really being dwindled. And a lot of them have really just got enough money to keep the lights on and, you know, look after people in real trouble. And added to that, in recent years, to cope with this change in funding, councils have had to seek private funding to balance the books. So again, in Manchester, where I live, our council is a part owner of the airport. It owns thousands of car parking spaces, and it's had to take that money to balance the books. But that's taken them away from this public purpose and perhaps a more traditional role of leading civic life. You know, when our Victorian forebears kind of built all these grand buildings, it was out of a very sense of civic duty. Councils are really hamstrung with that. And then this is made worse by the centralisation. So government funding formulas mean that in austerity, it was about £4 billion worth cut from councils in the north, at the same time as about £5 billion added to councils in the south. And then the third bit of context is around policy. So borough councils in particular do have significant policy control in areas like housing, planning and transport, which is my focus. But, and, you know, I think there's been an estimate, I'm not sure if it was by Friends of the Earth or a local government association, that it can actually impact up to 40% of carbon emissions through those policies. But again, to go back to centralisation, the power system means they're often hamstrung. So when it comes to transport, councils control the roads, but Department of Transport controls a lot of the guidelines. So until, as far as I know, even now, councils have to assess walking and cycling schemes, whether based on whether they slow down the traffic, and if they do, they might not get through. Select committees made recommendations to change that, still hasn't been changed. So that's just an important context to take into this webinar's question of like, how do councils engage communities? This is where councils are. Having said all of that, so what about engagement? So the climate crisis is a huge societal challenge, and it will involve massive change. And that is going to involve tension, because the human brain, we don't like change. And so we have to plan for this tension. And this is what I perceive to be has been missing. We've gone from strategies with climate action in to implementing the action. And basically, we've got to rebuild this connection between communities and civic leaders in our councils. And tension doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. If you haven't got tension, you're probably not doing it right, because you're probably not tackling the right issues. So no single body has the answer, and we can't, even more than that, we can't all act effectively without acting together. And related to that, when it comes to behaviour change, as it is called, we can't actually enable people to change their behaviour without tackling all these things at the same time. It's not about education. It's not about mindset or persuasion. Maybe there's a little bit of education needed, but it's about a holistic approach that enables people, place, and kind of market to come together and change to happen at the same time. So what I posit to you all is that the fundamental missing link is that we need to rebuild this connection between people and councils, who are the sort of embodiment at a local level of that civic leadership. They control policy, they control the purse. And till recently, I posit that it's been missed out of climate planning. We've got strategies, we've got in Manchester, we need 11,000 homes to be retrofit a year, and we need 1 million fewer car journeys a day. But in order to make that change, we're going to have to all work together, including with communities. So I think the council as civic leader can either be initiating this dialogue, or it can be joining partnerships who are initiating that dialogue. But either way, councils have to take a completely different approach to one that I posit is in their sort of cultural DNA at the moment, which has come from this backdrop of cuts and centralisation, which has left them kind of a bit, I think, retreated inside their town halls, away from the public gaze. They're used to getting complaints. So the Localism Act, a bit history, in 2011 was meant to change all of this. It came in and it was like, right, this is a fundamental shift of power to local, whoop-de-doo. And unfortunately, that has largely failed, partly because all of the things that would really underpin that around changing the way we're funded haven't changed. A review carried out in 2018 of the Localism Act said that it had largely failed, and talked about how it could be built on to this fundamental shift of power, and it described this new thing called a power partnership. And it said that the single biggest thing getting in the way was councils' risk management of a risk-averse approach, and that for councils to be able to move towards this power relationship with communities, they needed to move away from a risk management approach towards enabling thriving community through partnership. And this is what my single biggest point is. How do we create that partnership? I'm going to post a link in the chat. The report that I'm talking about contains 7 key steps to engagement. You don't need me to tell you how to do that. There's any number of expert guidelines on how to engage communities, and they're all about this partnership. Some examples that we're doing locally are where I'm working on a community engagement project that we haven't started yet, but we are going to, is, for instance, we want to create a understanding of the pollution and traffic data in our community. So we're working with the community to say, what data would you like to know? Would you like to become a data champion? Would you like to help us collect that data? It's your data. That's a tiny example. So I think that my last point is that councils also can and should go the other way. I think the community response to the coronavirus crisis, in particularly lockdown 1, where millions of people kind of just spontaneously acted in a crisis response, helping neighbours, shopping for neighbours, doing things, forming mutual aid groups in response to a crisis. We are in a climate crisis, it's just happening a bit more slowly, but there are those people out there. So councils going out to meet these communities is what is needed. And I think there is now funding being focused on community engagement. And if that funding can be accessed, that is the funding that can help create this new partnership between community and council. My project has accessed funding from the National Lottery Climate Action Fund. And that is one example. That's a 10-year fund, 9 more years to go. And it's another reason to say to councils, get on board with this partnership approach, because increasingly the money that they need will not be coming from government because of all the desperate financial situations we're in, but it may sit outside of the local government structure. And if you work in partnership, then you can access that funding. And some groups are already doing that. If you look at Cornwall and Cumbria, they have both got climate action partnerships that are built on a community council relationship, and they've been going for some years. And I think that shows us the way forward, because as I said, we can't do all this on our own. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's always wonderful to hear your perspective from, I guess, someone who's a self-educated expert, and we always really appreciate that. And also your kind of, I guess, the psychology behind it as well. I always find really interesting. So thank you for sharing that with us today. Next, after a few technical issues, we do have Josh joining us today. Josh is, we're really happy to have Josh here, because I think we've all seen that throughout this debate, the youth voice has been so important and will be important as we continue to tackle the climate crisis. So Josh is just 18. He's a youth climate activist. He's currently on a gap year with the deferred place to study mechanical engineering at Imperial College London. Josh is a campaign coordinator of Mock COP26 and works as an international campaign coordinator for Teach the Future, a climate action education campaign. As I said, we're really pleased to have Josh here today. So Josh, over to you.
Is not very reliable. So I thought the first thing I would say is maybe a little bit about what Mock COP was, in case people were unaware of that, of what happened. And as you're probably aware, COP26 was postponed last year until November 2021. And there were a group of young people who felt frustrated that that had happened and that there wasn't going to be that platform and that discussion around urgent climate policy happening. So we decided we'd run our own version with young people representing their countries. And with, sorry, am I a bit quiet? Is that a bit better?
Josh, you're coming across slightly quiet. I think we can just about hear you. I don't know if you can get any closer to your microphone.
Okay. Is this, I'll try speaking up. Is that a bit better now?
That sounds much better. Thanks, Josh.
So Mock COP happened in November and December in 2020, and it brought together over 330 delegates representing over 140 countries. So these delegations represented the youth of their country, and they came together to discuss climate policy, and they produced 18 policies in a treaty. So that was really just illustrating the what young people wanted to see from their world leaders. And I think that what we've seen through lots of youth climate action is that young people are more ambitious typically than the current leaders. And I think lots of that comes from a sort of unique perspective of the world. We're not yet able to vote, lots of us. We're not in positions of power. So we're just sort of watching what's happening and coming up with our own opinions of what is happening. And so when we're thinking about what we'd like to see us, what do we want to see in 10, 20 years' time, it's taking that long view. And I think that gives a really unique perspective of thinking long term that I think lots of governing misses at the moment, is that thinking really short term and not thinking of a long term plan. And also I think another thing that's important with young people is that young people don't really have vested interests. They're not shareholders, they don't run businesses, they don't have other motives for delaying or speeding up particular bills or actions. So I think it gives a more sort of natural opinion of what people think is important. And I think that councils particularly are in a really unique position to be able to listen to young people and engage with them. In every community there will be young people, and councils are right there in the community. Sorry, I might be having an issue with my microphone. I think as well that even from a sort of purely, I guess, troubleshooting point of view, by engaging with young people now, it helps with that handover, because at some point it will be young people who will be the decision makers, it will be the politicians, who will be the business leaders. So I think by engaging with young people at the moment, it's going to make that transition easier when young people become the decision makers. And actually some of the opinions and views that come across from the youth of the country and the youth of the world, some of them will be really good ideas. And it's just really exciting to see young people having these conversations. I think we've seen from lots of the action that young people have driven that there's a real sense of unity across the world. There's huge networks like Fridays for Future, where people, despite language barriers and time zone differences, are able to communicate and share information and work together. And I think that online unity and use of new technology is something that young people can particularly bring to these issues.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks for persevering despite technical issues. Something we've learned this year, that we've got to get broadband out to our rural areas properly as well. So thanks for joining us today. We've had some really great questions come in. We've got, what have we got? About 8 or 9 minutes left. So I was going to open up to the panel on a few of these questions. First of all, and anyone that wants to answer this can, specifically might be interesting for you, Simon. How do councils outside London require a whole life carbon assessment for new buildings, supplementary planning guidance, or something else? Simon, do you want to start us off with that?
Yep, sorry, I was just telling you my thing. Yeah, I think you have to do something like supplementary planning guidance. Obviously, if your local plan is being updated, then you want to try and include that in that, include this in that. I mean, I'm happy to talk to anybody, but I think if you were to look at the GLA's London plan, you would get an idea of the kind of stuff that might be useful. I think that people have to be encouraged to understand this, if I can put it like that, because I think that either people are, operating on their own requirements and narrow perspectives. And I think people have to realize that reducing carbon emissions is not A, costly, and B, it has actual real benefits in what you're building.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Chris, do you want to come in on that?
Just very briefly, we have done a lot of work in Oxfordshire with a planner or two to develop a climate emergency supplementary planning document, which 3 or 4 councils have found quite helpful. And I think we can't wait for local plans to be reviewed. We have got this, doing a full live carbon survey is one thing, but setting the standards, especially for new buildings, is something councils can do through an SPD, and the government recently reaffirmed that councils are able to set higher standards than the national ones, and councils really need to use that. I'll put a link to the SPD in the website, in the chat room.
Wonderful, thanks, Chris. I'm going to move on to another question. Claire, maybe this is a good one for you. This one says, as a council, we're committed to our target of 2028. I agree that we need better framework nationally. As a council, we also need to have funding and support. We can look at what we are doing, and we can move forward as much as we can. But the decision making isn't the only issue. It's the cost and the fact that people in the local area don't have cash readily available. How can we tackle these issues? Claire, let's come to you on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think my premise is the first step is to create that partnership with the community. And then the second step is to what can we do together? What we've got this big challenge. What can we do? Which bits can we try and tackle? But you can't do the second bit without doing the first bit. And my experience when you do talk, when I've started to have conversations with people, often it's quite small things that will make people feel empowered. So it's the start of that relationship. This has to be an ongoing thing. This is like a 20-year mission we're on, right? So this is why it's about rebuilding a link that has been destroyed from our civic life, or has been eroded, I should say. So, people will say things like, when you say, what should we do about carbon zero, transport? So can I have somewhere to store my bike safely? They'll say, can we have a bit of space to plant some trees? And these are things that will then help community grow in confidence. There are people in the community already doing those things, so it can make those people feel empowered, because there's then maybe a little bit of funding to support them. That creates what's called community capacity. So it gives, it can kind of draw in more volunteers, because you can see that the action can result in further action. So yeah, I know we've got to do this really quickly, but I don't think you can rush it from like, get the dialogue, get the partnership in place, ask people, start small, build trust, see what they say.
Wonderful, thanks, Claire. I'm aware we're very short on time here, so I'd like to finish up with just a quick fire across the whole panel. So a two-part question. So first of all, if speaking to a council, what would you say is the one most important thing they can do in tackling the climate crisis? And the same question, but to residents, just normal homeowners or renters or anyone in their own community. So Josh, let's go to you first.
I think from councils, it would be great for councils to make really strong statements to say how important they feel this is and how important it is for their community, to really build that conversation that this is important to lots of people and it's not a really small issue that's sort of confined to a small corner. And I think from the populations, I think it would be really helpful for them to continue to make this a really important issue when they come to vote and when they come to engage with their leaders and their councillors, to say this is something really important to us, and to come up with ideas of like, this could be done here or that could be done here from the community bottom up level.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Claire, let's go to you, and then Chris, and then Simon. That's the order you're on my screen.
Okay, councils, open up, let go, share the problem. Residents, make this the fundamental issue by which you decide how to vote and how to spend your money.
Yeah, councils, make the plan. Worry less about whether you're going to be zero carbon in 2035 or 2038, and more about what you're going to do in the next 2 or 3 years. Publish that so that people can see it and then do it, because that's the way you'll get trusted. Local people, if you've got the time, get involved with any kind of local climate group, understand what your councils are doing, and feel confident enough to start talking and writing to your local councillor. Build that relationship.
So I'll go. So I kind of agree with what's been said by everybody else, actually, but I would add to this, and that is that none of this is optional. This has to be done. This is real. And if we thought that COVID was a problem, I mean, this is going to dwarf that completely. So we have to act. And as I say, it's not optional. It's essential and mandatory. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Some really great, concise answers there. I appreciate that. Again, thanks so much to our panel for joining us today, and thanks so much to all of you. We've had a wonderful number of people with us today. I know we've had lots of council officers and lots of councillors, and also just members of the public too. So that's really wonderful to have you all engaged. Again, we will send out a recording, a link to this webinar, that if you want to go back and see any of it again, and also we'll send out a way that you can get in touch with us here at Commonplace if you'd like to do some work with us, if you'd like to partner with us, particularly on our climate action plans and the heat maps and the design feedback modules that we're offering around that. So do get in touch with us. Bang on 12 o'clock. I'm going to end it there, and thanks so much for joining us, and hope to see you all again soon.